Just to make sure you're in the right place, the lecture of this evening is the Kosher Kitchen, Pesach and Beyond. We had to find a way to make sure we had an outstanding turnout, so we decided to have it here instead of upstairs. If we had it upstairs, I know there'd be too much room. Here, we knew we'd get a full house. Baruch Hashem. The program this evening is being sponsored by David and Fran Wolf in honor of Rabbi and Rabbi Milevsky for all the things they've done, and I don't have to say anymore. Thank you very much, David. Where's Fran? I know she's here. Thank you.
That's it.
I'll leave you more time.
Good evening. Thank you, David. Thank you, Fran. I think we're going to be reviewing Hilchos Pesach. I don't know why so many people came. It's basically what you did last year, do it again this year.
Go home now.
Nothing changed. Nothing changed. I have no new leniencies, no new stringencies. So just do what you did last year. I don't really. Let's go home. Smart. You think I forgot.
That's right.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, I think already a few months ago, we have here between Mincha and Ma'ariv an opportunity every single day to study something. You study here. Sometimes it's 12 minutes, sometimes maybe 15 minutes. And we were discussing a few halachot of kashrut. That's important, it's our identity. It's what keeps the food that keeps, the soul and the body together. You want to have it right. It plays a significant role in our life. We're studying the laws of kashrut. Now, when we study the laws here, we're not just giving the bottom line. We're not just giving a list of what you should be eating or should not be eating. You want to know a little bit about the history of things. How these laws came into existence. I'm always fascinated by equipment, right? Equipment that was not in existence during Talmudic times. And then it shows up at some point. How did the rabbis deal with it? These are very interesting things. And we had a discussion. I shared here some rabbinic literature that appears in a work called Haggaot Maimoniot. Haggaot Maimoniot. And it works as follows. When we talk about Maimonides, Rambam, we're all familiar with the Rambam. We know very well that if we would visit a European yeshiva in the 12th century, they heard of the Rambam, but they barely quote him, like the Tosafot, right? The grandchildren of Rashi. They quote the Rambam, so this is literature basically of the 12th century. So Rambam dies in 12th century into the 13th century, I should say. Rambam dies in 1204. They barely quote him. However, within 70 years, the works of Maimonides become actually popular in Europe. And there's a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Meir HaKohen. Rabbi Meir HaKohen writes a work called Haggaot, his commentaries on the works of the Rambam. And it's unique there because he is the first that somehow blends these two worlds. The world of the Baalei HaTosfot, of the great French rabbis, with the works of the Rambam. Rabbi Meir was massacred in 1298, one of the many pogroms, if we call it a pogrom. And in his work, he quotes earlier literature from probably 80 years beforehand that has to do, and you're going to have to remember these words, it has to do with the paladin and the pashtir. So these are pieces of equipment that we're going to become familiar with. And it works as follows. Okay, so now, piece of information number one. Did you ever kosher at home? Kosher things. Someone messes something up, usually a husband, things are messed up, and there's a need to go ahead and kosher. We're very familiar with that concept. We know very well that when it comes to koshering, there are times that the item that requires koshering needs a high-end koshering. A high-end koshering means destroyed but a little bit less, right? That's what it basically means. For example, if someone puts on your grill a piece of meat that's simply not kosher, that needs a high-end koshering. Your grill, the racks, are going to have to reach a glow. And odds are, you could say goodbye to your grill. Okay, that's a high-end koshering. Then there is a low-end koshering. Low-end koshering is when you go ahead and you boil some water in a pot and you throw in the cutlery. That's a low-end koshering. Fine. Now, Gemara tells us that you should know. When it comes to koshering, you have to identify the status of the substance as it is being absorbed. What does that mean? If you have a substance that when it is being absorbed into the vessel, the substance is permissible, so to purge such a substance, that requires a low-end koshering. I'll give you an example. In the days of the Bet HaMikdash, Kohanim were eating a lot of meat. Because in the Bet HaMikdash, they were slaughtering their animals, and the Kohanim had to eat. Now, the meat, when it was left over, quite often by the next day, it was prohibited. You shouldn't be eating leftover meat. It was called actually notar, nosar. Leftovers. No good. Right? We don't say that at home. But leftovers in the temple, no good. Bet HaMikdash, unacceptable. Now the problem is, if the meat that is left over is no good, if I have a vessel, if I have a spit, and they roasted some meat on that spit, and then the next day, that meat itself is not acceptable, so obviously, the little bit of meat that's absorbed into the spit, into the vessel, also is something that I should be avoiding. So therefore, in the Bet HaMikdash, they went through a koshering. They would kosher spits. Kosher the utensils used for the processing of the holy meat. However, when the meat was absorbed into the vessel, it was a permissible substance, meaning when the meat was on the grill, on the spit, that was permissible, so therefore it required a low-end koshering, what the rabbis called heterabala. Okay, you get the idea, but that's not as relevant because unfortunately we don't have a Bet HaMikdash. However, if let's say I have a spit and it was used for actual non-kosher, they have hotels. You have a hotel that has a kosher room, and by mistake they took one of the spits from the kosher room and they use it for non-kosher meat. When they need to kosher it, it needs a high-end koshering because the substance absorbed into that spit is a prohibited substance trait. You get the idea between the two? Now, if let's say I have a piece of equipment in my kitchen that was used for milchiks, and I want to go ahead and use it for fleishiks, and I want to go ahead and purge the flavor that was absorbed into the milchiks piece of equipment, what kind of purging would it require? Is it... Why high-end? Let's go for low-end. Why low-end? Why low-end? Because the substance was permissible. Milchiks is permissible. Now someone's going to say, well, wait a second. Don't we not kosher back and forth from milchiks to fleishiks? Well, true in general, but we, in our kitchen, we only have one oven. So if you only have one oven, you're going to use it for both. You do need to go through some kind of koshering, meaning if I just, or my wife, Chief Miriam, just made uncovered lasagna in the oven, and steam, milchik steam is in the oven, and then after you want to go ahead and use it for fleishiks, it does require some kind of purging, but I think you agree that low-end purging is enough, correct? You do agree? You do agree. How do you do it, you wonder? How do you do it? So now we're going to go through some literature. And this author, the author here, is going to be sharing with us not what great rabbis have to say on the matter, but rather what great Rebbitzins have to say on the matter. The psak here is not going to come from rabbinic authorities, but rather it's going to come from their wives, because they do know the kitchen. What do the rabbis know about the kitchen? It's the Rebbitzin that knows what's happening in the kitchen. This is a reality. So this is a fascinating piece of literature here, and it works as follows. There was a popular item called the pashtida, which is basically a kugel, but then there was a milchik dish known as the paladon. Both of them were popular at the time, and it seems to be that they did not have in their homes, at least at this time in France, so we're dealing with 12th century France, they did not have ovens. They didn't have microwaves, they did not have ovens. So the question is, how would they bake something? How would they bake something? Well, they used the stovetop. Can you bake on the stovetop? So it seems to be that they would use this, I would label it a deep frying pan. And what they would do is that they would heat this frying pan, heat it on coals, and then they would place the substance on the stovetop and then cover it. And that's how they would bake. Okay, so they would have this large frying pan. Now, people at that time did not own too many of those frying pans, of those deep frying pans. They would use it for milchiks, and then they would use it for fleishiks. This was the norm. And the question was, how much of a koshering do you need when you want to switch them back and forth? Now, by the 17th century, authorities say it's not ideal to switch back and forth, but at that time, it was done. And it was done in the house of the greatest people, the Baalei HaTosafot, they were known as. So here we go. So the author here does some research, and he starts asking different women in the family, what's the halacha? And he starts off with the almana, meaning the widow of my great uncle Rabbeinu Yitzchak. And he said, and she said, you should know, the norm was that they would heat it as any baker would heat it. Meaning they would not require this deep frying pan to become glowing. They would not require it to become red hot. They would heat it as any baker heats it, which we would consider a low-end koshering. And then they would put it on top of the milchik item, meaning it was first used to cover something fleishiks. Then they would put it on a heat source and cover something that is milchik. Switch it back and forth. That was all that was needed. And he goes on asking other members of the family. And he, for example, he finds out about Marat Miriam. Marat Miriam. Who was Marat Miriam? The wife of Rabbeinu Tam. She is another authority on this matter. But he notes that she had an interesting practice. Miriam, the second wife of Rabbeinu Tam, his first one passed away, and she used to require that this deep frying pan would reach a heat. Acheta adim. She was a machmir, it seems to be. She wanted those frying pans. She did not rely on what the other women in the family did. She wanted it to reach a glow. But then the author here shares with us that he is not sure if this is based on the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, or perhaps due to the fact that her first husband, a fellow by the name of Avraham, Shehaya Ragil Bechumrot, meaning it could be that her practice was something she adapted from her first husband, who followed great stringency, so I don't really know where she got it from. He ends up telling, after interviewing many of the women there, he notes that, by the way, bottom line is it doesn't need a high-end koshering, and this becomes the halacha. Because if, let's say, or someone in a kitchen, makes something milchiks, and there's no spill, and there's no residual milchiks, but you're concerned that some steam came out, and I want to switch it to fleishiks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my oven on 350. It should be on 350 perhaps for 10 minutes. That is obviously not a high-end koshering, but it's good enough. How do I know it's good enough? Because these women told me that it's good enough. And therefore, in the words of the author here, we rely on the edut, on the testimony of Banot Bnot Gdolei Hador, the daughters of the great leaders. Fascinating piece of literature. Now back to how this fits into the big picture. This is what we discussed here a few weeks ago. And someone walked up and said, this would be a good class for everyone, right? To discuss these areas and these issues of kashrut. And as a result, I decided to give a title to this class tonight, Pesach and Beyond. So I fulfilled the Beyond, and now we can go back to Pesach. Okay, that's what we took care of. I think it's an interesting discussion. Now, I'm going to make basically 10 points about Pesach. That's it. 10 points, and we'll hopefully remember them, and then we can move on. Are you ready for them? When I was in Memphis, I was at one point doing a lot of research on the history of Kitniot. We've discussed it here in detail. Kitniot, different periods, when it developed, how it's interesting to note that there was a rabbi in the 13th century, Rabbeinu Manoach, who notes that the reason you don't eat legumes, you don't eat beans on a Yom Tov, is because the Torah tells us, "V'samachta b'chagecha." You're supposed to be happy. How can you be happy eating beans? That's what one of the great rabbis said. And that's the reason he believes there is such a custom. Fascinating. This is what we are told. Now, you go through the 13th century authorities and you hear some saying it's a custom. We don't know why we do it. And other rabbis say it's a custom. We don't know why, so therefore we don't do it. Two different schools. And then there are those who came up with explanations as to why the custom developed. And there are two schools. There are those that say, well, legumes and rice are processed in a way that is similar to bread. So people might get mixed up. Okay, that's an explanation. Then there are those that say, no, that there was a time when people stored their grain together with their legumes. They were stored together. So therefore, when you would eat legumes on Pesach, people would say, be careful with your beans and be careful with your rice, because you have to check it, you have to be sure there's no grain. So once there was an issue, people said, you know what, I'm just not going to eat it. Different explanations given why. Then you had the debates that developed later. What about if it's a substance that, or is an ingredient that there was not in existence at the time, or the rabbis in northern France were not familiar with? Are they included or not? For example, is corn included, they wonder? Are peanuts included, they wonder? Is quinoa included? And there are different debates, and it's very fascinating to trace the luck of some items. How corn had bad luck. It had a bad name. You know what it was called? It was called Turkish wheat. Well, you call it wheat. You're not going to use it on Pesach, right? On the other hand, when it comes to peanuts, many people say, oh, well, you don't use peanuts. When Moshe Feinstein fell, I don't understand why there's an issue with peanuts, right? Different things. And the quinoa debate, which was one that we merited to see over the last decade. Here in Toronto itself, how the COR versus no, and then they say maybe. It just shows how fascinating this topic is. Kitniot. So I'm doing research on kitniot. And then I realized that there was a big to-do that relates to the oil of kitniot. And I've discussed it here. And what was fascinating is the fact that earlier on, the oils were produced, up until late 19th century, oils were produced where they would soak. It could be sesame, it could be any of the kitniot, were first soaked. So obviously there is an issue. When eventually, in the beginning of the 20th century, you have equipment that it could extract oils without the substance coming in contact with water, so then the rabbis wonder, perhaps there's no issue at all. And then, this was something we discussed, that in 1909, Rav Kook, the chief rabbi of Yafo at the time, gave an ashgacha, gave a supervision to a sesame oil production in Yafo, and it was produced in a way where they toasted the sesames, it never came in contact with water, they extracted it in a way that he believed that was 100% fine, but the rabbis of the old Yishuv in Yerushalayim were very upset because they believed that you are breaking with tradition, and this made a major issue. And there was a pamphlet that came out. It was a rare pamphlet that Rav Kook put out in 1909 describing his opinion on the matter and the reaction that that was coming from Yerushalayim, and I was very excited about the issue when I was researching it. And I found out that in New York, in one of the libraries of rare books, you could find that pamphlet. And I went to New York, and I was able to get it, and I was able to look at it, and I asked them if I could take pictures of it, and they said absolutely not, but they have equipment that could take pictures without me damaging the rare book, and every page would cost me $6. I said, you know what, I'll try to memorize every page. $6. But I went through it, and I took notes, and I was all excited, and I come back to Memphis, and I give a shir on it, and then I go visit the old rabbi in town, Rabbi Nata Grimblatt, and I told him, you won't believe what I saw. I saw the rare book. He says, oh. And he takes a chair, puts it by a shelf, removes it from his stock shelf, says, here, take it home. You can bring it back when you're finished. That was my travel and my experience. So, kitniyot were always fascinating to me, and how they are evolving the issues regarding the oils of kitniyot. I shared with you that I still have that big yetzer hara, that strong urge to make, remember it, what my yetzer hara is? Peanut oil, correct. Why peanut oil? Why that mishugas? I'll tell you why I have that mishugas. Because in the 1950s, my grandfather in Uruguay sent a question to the great rabbis in Yerushalayim with the status of peanut oil, and the rabbis gave their approval, among them the great Rabbi Pesach Frank, and he notes that there are two good reasons why it's 100% fine. Number one, it's because it's peanuts, and number two, because it's oil. Because number one, the decree of kitniyot never applied to a food that the rabbis in northern France were not familiar with, and therefore peanuts are not included in kitniyot. So that's reason number one why it's permissible. Reason number two is that if you could go ahead and extract oil without it coming into contact with water, there's no issue at all. So therefore peanut oil is 100% fine, and so my grandfather is associated with this tshuva, so I have that desire. I can find it, even though I do know that in the past it was an available product. But nevertheless, I always had an interest with. Can you still get the peanut oil? Yeah. We all have peanut oil. And anyone safe from those? Yeah, they have any whole bottle. Vanished. Okay, it's chaval. So now you know what my dreams are. What was that? Well, theoretically, yes, but there's not. Remember the percentage of oil. It's not like the percentage. Theoretically, yes. Now, my point, what I want to share with you is the following: with all history of minhagim, right? Sometimes knowing too much of history could damage an appreciation for a minhag. And it's something I have to tell myself quite often. Because you study the history, right, and you know how things develop, like for example, I share the story that, the Kosher that we have, it's not mentioned in literature, it's not mentioned in the 16th century. After that it appears. And there was a rabbi in Izmir in the 17th century who shares with us the following, that I've seen the Ashkenazim do this kos shel aliyah. And you know what it's from? Minhag shera'iti, the custom that I saw by the Ashkenazim, is that during the Seder, they have an empty cup, and then when they finish drinking from their cup, and no one's going to finish all the wine in their cup, they pour it into that empty cup, and that's called kos shel aliyah. In other words, it's sitting there, it's half full, and the kids ask, what's that cup for? And they say, it's for Elio Hanavi. So that's how this Sephardi authority believes the custom developed. Yes, no, doesn't make a difference. But the importance is that even if you know the history, you should still value the minhag. And that's why my recommendation number one is, if you have a tradition, don't change it. Don't become more stringent. Don't become more lenient. If there's something you grew up with, and it's not making you meshuga. In other words, if you have something absurd that perhaps will damage something far more important, which is called Simchas Yom Tov, then you have to come up with leniencies, because you have to protect the essence of Pesach. The essence of Pesach is v'samachta b'chagecha. And if you have mishugasim that you adapted, that were handed to you, so you have to work with them. Otherwise, if it's not going to damage Yom Tov itself, minhagim have value. There's something that they are valuable, and this is message number one. appreciate a minhag. You know, when we talk about kitniot and kitniot derivatives, you know, there are differences. I speak to David about here in Israel. So when you're in Israel, if you turn to an halachic authority there, and there will be different answers. If it's a rabbi that's associated with the religious Zionist, he's going to give one type of answer. If you ask your shalizer to the Eida Haredis, so they'll give you different answers there. But the point is, ask someone there. You become part of a structure, part of a community, and you could follow their customs, right? Because minhagim are not really, as we've discussed in the past, they're not really what my parents did, they're what my community do. They make me part of a community. And it's appropriate that if you are a member in a shul, to do what others do. Don't make yourself different. Value the minhagim. That's point number one. Value them. Understand them. Appreciate the history. But value them. Let's go for number two. Dikas chametz. Getting rid of chametz. Okay. Now, I have memories of my grandmother. 3 months before Pesach, saying, Oy vey, kim Erev Pesach. That's my grandma. Oy vey, Erev Pesach. Oy, Erev Pesach. And I don't think it's healthy. That was part of the culture, because at Erev Pesach you have to do all the curtains. And you have to take a toothbrush and scrub over there, up there, right? You have to scrub. You see the vent? You have to scrub inside the vent because it's Erev Pesach. Now, is that halacha? Well, the halacha, believe it or not, is that a perur, a crumb, is batel. So therefore, a lot of the cleaning that is done is spring cleaning. It is nice, but again, spring cleaning should not damage Pesach itself. It's a Yom Tov. It's a time for a family to get together, appreciate our identity. So therefore, number two, crumbs are nullified. When you do bdikat chametz, what are you looking for? You're not looking for a crumb. What you are looking for is that good candy bar or wafer that you were hiding from someone, or one of the kids were hiding from me. And therefore I check the kids' backpacks, right? Then I'm going to go ahead and check the kids' pockets, because I do know that there's a bisli somewhere there, and I don't mean one bisli, I mean a bag of bisli that was being concealed. Because nice things came in during Purim, thank you so much. But what do the kids do when no one's looking? They go ahead and they take items to be sure that no one else takes it. Those are the items that you will find on Erev Pesach. That is bdikat chametz. Less than a kazais, less than the volume of olive is absolutely not an issue. Now, it's interesting that I used, as a child, I would read literature of great rabbinic personalities. And I remember reading about the great Steipler, who was a righteous Torah scholar of Bnei Brak, that on the eve of the 14th of Nisan, he would pull out his candle, and he would get on the floor and really check for every crumb. And it was very inspiring to me. And I remember being a bit disturbed at age 14 how, the great rabbinic authorities do it. And then I come home, and how did my father do bdikas chametz? He would light a candle and come to a drawer, open it up, and say, he would turn to my mother, Chai, I shouldn't care, or my mother's name. Was this drawer checked? My mother said, yeah, was it? Okay, he would close it. Thank you. Hi, was this drawer checked? Yeah, close it. And I said, where's the Steipler? The Steipler did it for, it took him 6 hours. And my father did it in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I remember being a bit disturbed at the time. And then I looked through rabbinic literature, and I realized that this way that my father did it is actually mentioned by other great rabbinic authorities, like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that we, in our houses, we check and we clean the whole house before Pesach. So what you are really doing on the eve of the 14th is just being sure that everything was clean. Due to the fact that perhaps you're not going to find anything, there are those that have that custom of putting out crumbs of bread. Some of you put 10. By the way, it's important that each piece should not be larger than the volume of an olive, because if it is a large piece and you can't find it, it's not fun, right? You put out 10 and you find 9. I have a friend in Memphis, right? And the friend in Memphis told me that they had this custom that they would put out the 10 pieces, and the kids would follow around, and when they would find a piece, they would go, da-dam, with great excitement that they found the piece. And they go ahead and they do the bdikas chametz on the eve of the 14th, and they find 9 of them. And they check the whole house, and they don't find it. They give up. 24 hours later, the 5-year-old walks in during the Seder. Ta-da! Right? So you don't want that happening, right? Maybe have a GPS on each one of those pieces. Make a list. A list, yeah. List of locations are important, but if you make it less than a kazait, you don't have to worry about it. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is another point. I think it's point around number 4. In Mechirat Chametz, we sell our chametz. Historically, prior to the 17th century, if you want to sell your chametz, you're more than welcome. But the way you would sell your chametz is that you would put it in a bag and go to a non-Jew and hand it to them. And it would leave your domain. And then after Pesach, if he's kind enough, he would sell it back. However, as Jews entered into the alcohol industry, and they actually were in that business because many of the puritzim, the mayors, would not trust the non-Jews. So what would they do? Jews were in selling alcohol. Come Pesach, what are you going to do? Deliver 75 barrels to someone? Impossible. So therefore, the style and the system of the Mechirat Chametz that we are familiar with, that we're not actually delivering, but rather we transfer it to them with different technical, what we call kinyanim, is something that develops during that period of time. Now, we're going to address the fact that there were some issues that existed. What I want to focus on is the fact that, remember, this is a holiday. This is a time when we keep away from chametz. And even though you could technically work out basically keeping everything where it is, it could perhaps affect the spirit of the day. For example, to have in the same refrigerator that you are using during Pesach, chametz, with a shelf that is covered. It is, I'm not saying that it's prohibited, but I don't know if that's really the spirit of a time that you are separating yourself completely from chametz. Not prohibited, but just be mindful of the fact that this is a time that those items that are actual chametz, they're not yours. They're really not yours. And technically speaking, if you do that, be sure to write on the document itself that shelf, lower shelf on fridge is covered. I personally, we wouldn't do that because I'm not comfortable. This is my fridge. I don't want items that are not mine, items that I should not be owning during this day in my refrigerator. Others perhaps do. But be mindful of the concept. It is a time that historically we got rid of everything. All chametz out of our house. Today, it is difficult. We don't do that. But the ideal way of Mechirat Chametz is have a designated location. Have a cupboard. Have a refrigerator in the garage, perhaps. Have areas that you write in the document. These are the areas that I am selling to the non-Jew. Look at those areas during Pesach and look at it as a cupboard that simply does not belong to you. Okay, that is the way to do it. There is no need at all to write in your document that you're selling any chametz that could be found under a couch, because simply you have checked your chametz, you've cleaned. Don't worry about the chametz under the couch. What you are selling is designated locations. And spell it out and understand it actually is being transferred into the domain of someone else. This is something that I think is important to remember. We have the idea of shuls burning chametz. Familiar? People sometimes, I don't know if it's a problem here, but people sometimes feel that their chametz needs to be burnt, and included is a spoon, a feather, a box of cereal, a pizza box. We've seen people just dump and run, like Sheamus, that they just dump it by a shul and they run. So people Erev Pesach feel that they... Let me tell you the truth of how things work. Burning chametz is only a custom. The custom is to burn a little bit, and therefore if it's the volume of an olive, that is enough. The rest of the chametz you could sell, you could throw out if indeed it leaves your domain. You could eat it if you like to. You don't have to burn pizza boxes, cereal boxes. No need to burn it. The burning is a custom, only a small amount. If you are traveling, by the way, if let's say you are traveling, this year it's a Friday. If Friday morning you're traveling and you can't burn it, you don't have to find someone else to burn it. You could flush that little bit of chametz down the toilet. Be sure not to clog it. But that is good enough. That is good enough because you are getting rid of it. Okay, that's another piece of information that you have to remember. Now,
does your garbage have to be picked up before the morning?
Okay, so it works as follows. Ideally, your garbage is technically yours. Ideally, have the garbage out. In other words, don't have chametz in your garbage. That's ideal. There are ways around it in case of difficulty. There are places here in Toronto we could dump them. Some people include it in the sale, which is also durable. There are those who argue that if you put it by the curb, it's not really yours. So I would label it as ideally not to have chametz in a garbage can. Okay, that's how I would label it. What was that? This year's Tuesday is garbage day here. So I think we're going to have those 3 days that we're going to have to figure it out. But there are areas you could...
Thank God and Garney Williams will be having a garbage throw out all week.
Because we are here in Greater Vaughan, so we're able to... It's important to remember that on the Seder itself you have to eat matzah shmura. It's important to remember that technically speaking, every single matzah on the market, even if it doesn't say shmura, technically is considered shmura, because from the time of kneading, there was a shmira. However, it is considered ideal to eat shmura from the time of tzira. It is important to remember that does not mean that your matzah has to be hand. There are those, and I know most of you look at such people like myself who eat only machine shmura as people from a different planet, but I'm telling you straight out, it's 100% fine. We don't eat hand matzah. And if you remember here, when we had a class on the issue, and we had the Rabbi Schwabacher looking at the production of hand matzah in the middle of the 19th century, and you saw workers coming to the production to knead with their bare hands. This is before soap was popular. And these are people who are kneading with their hands what you're going to be eating the Seder nights. And he said that such food is muktzah machmas mius, muktzah machmas isur. It's something you should distance yourself because it's prohibited, because the awareness was very weak at the time. And he said it was disgusting as well. Times have changed. I don't want to discuss anyone out of their hand matzah, and there's tradition there, because obviously it dates back many, many years. But in Yerushalayim, many of the old community, it's very, very common there that people eat shmura machine. Shmura machine is consumed, and it is fine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's a custom that I have, and for the time being, I'm sticking to that custom. I don't eat hand matzahs throughout Pesach. That's the minhag I have. Just be aware of it. We've discussed this in detail as well. Why is it, when it comes to other prohibitions, if food is no longer edible to a human, we no longer consider it prohibited? But with Pesach, we have these interesting laws. What are the laws of Pesach? That it is considered chametz as long as the dog is going to. What is with the dog? How did the dog come into Pesach? Right? We are told that when they left Egypt, L'chol bnei Israel, the dogs did not bark. But that's not the reason. That's not the connection. So what's it about? So it works as follows. You should know that bread, even if it is sitting there for 2 weeks and it's moldy, it still has value, because you could use it as sourdough. And since sourdough, the starter, retains significance, and as long as a dog would eat it, it has its significance. So therefore, we've kept those guidelines for all chametz issues. All chametz. If a dog will consume it, it is considered chametz. We have an interesting thing. My younger sister, who lives in Baltimore, owns a dog. She owns a dog, and for our family, this was a major to-do. In other words, in the world that my mother grew up in, right? No one has a dog, but my sister has a dog, and it was needed for a kid probably. And the name of the dog is Lacey. Now Lacey, if you check my emails among my family members over the past 18 months, most of them relate to Lacey. Lacey is disgusting. And now Lacey is a very lucky dog, because Lacey gets her meat grilled. She eats high-end. For whatever reason, they treat Lacey far better than we were treated as kids. But all the food is high-end. And she's not going to eat if it's something if the meat is not perfect. Lacey doesn't eat it. So they wonder if for Pesach, right, they have a situation here that any food that is any chametz that's a little bit not perfect, perhaps for them, is no longer an issue because it's Einaroy Lachilas Lacey. That's the question that they deal with in Baltimore among family members, but it's something that needs some clarification. You know, it's when I study the issues of the past, the shilas of the past, you could really get quite emotional for the issues. We talked about the owners of taverns. And there was a story, this is an actual story, and this happened more than once, that you're an owner of a tavern, you sell it on Pesach to a non-Jew. The non-Jew does not have the thousands of rubles required to pay for it, so the non-Jew gives you a down payment. Technically speaking, during Pesach, who owns the alcohol, the whiskey? The non-Jew. So what happened is on first day of Pesach, the non-Jew is walking, he says, hey, wait a second. I own 75 barrels of high-end whiskey. Let me sample it a little bit. And he goes in, he owns it after all, and he takes one shot, and it's good, he enjoys it, and it turned into 2, 3, 4, and he is laying there and he's consuming his alcohol, and the next thing, the owner walks by on Pesach, coming home from shul, and he sees that this store that he obviously doesn't own on Pesach, that's owned by the non-Jew, the door is wide open, and he sees there 2 non-Jews on the floor out, and they're still drinking, and he knows that what's going to occur is as follows, that within 8 days, all 75 barrels of whiskey are going to be gone. So when after Pesach, he turns to him and he says, okay, pay me the 2,000 rubles, golden rubles, the guy's going to say, the drunk obviously will not be able to pay. And when any other year when they can't pay back, what you would do is you would buy back the alcohol. Here there's going to be absolutely nothing left. This is a serious crisis. So he comes to the rabbi crying and he says, what do I do? You know, this is my livelihood. This is my family. Can I put on a lock on the door? And the rabbi says, you can't put a lock on the door, because if you put a lock on the door, what are you indicating? That it wasn't a sale. So the guy's going crazy. So what does the rabbi do? This is a beautiful story. The rabbi calls the non-Jew. The non-Jew comes to him. And the rabbi says to him, listen, I have a job. I need you to deliver this letter, right, to the shtetl that's, 25 miles down the road. I'll pay you nicely. Just deliver it. The non-Jew leaves. And he's gone for Pesach. Right? That's what the rabbi did. And that did not affect the status of the sale because no lock was placed. He just sent them away. These were the type of issues that existed. And when you look at the times, there's a lot of literature during 19th century and early 20th century when rabbis, Hungarian rabbis even, they allowed kitniot. Why? There was nothing to eat. There were times that people had these difficulties. Today we have what first world problem? We have is blessing, that we have the amount of Baruch Hashem indeed. Yes, Sobeys raises the prices under a bunch of ganovim, and so is Costco. They could go ahead and come here at Pesach, and they could take the same salmon, right, which throughout the year is for $22, and they'll shoot up to $30. And these are the tzaras that we have, but Baruch Hashem, these are not the tzaras that they had in the past. It is something that we need to be thankful for. A few guidelines, basic ones. Erev Pesach, we don't eat matzah. We don't eat matzah. So now, what do you eat? I still remember as a child that when after the burning of the chametz, I would feel this starvation of nothing to eat. And I would ask my mom, what's there to eat? I would ask my mom, and you know what she would say? It was hard-boiled eggs and potatoes. 2 things that Rabbeinu Shalom, that's what we're going to go and eat. We were used to cereal. It was a challenging time. So now, what do you eat? So you have to remember the following, that the prohibition of eating matzah Erev Pesach only applies to the type of matzah that you could fulfill your obligation with at night. If you cook a matzah, you can no longer fulfill the obligation at night, at the Seder night. So therefore, one option is cook a matzah. In other words, put the pot. I don't know how that tastes, but there's something called knedels, which are lovely. What?
Can you do matzah fry, or it has to be
Okay,
boiled?
now it has to be
Boiled.
It has to be that there is enough oil to cover it, which I don't know how that's going to do for your stomach. But if it's just a little bit, that would not be enough. It has to be actually cooking it. Oh, so
The
okay.
matzah
Now here
bread,
comes the Sephardim.
You have to,
And the Sephardim say, yeah, egg matzah, thank you very much. Now, because it's another Ashkenazi tradition that we avoid egg matzah, unfortunately. So you could smile away, and we have to deal with our traditions. But
matzah bread is soaked though. You have to soak it in water.
it has to be soaked in a clear rishon. If you first soak your matzah, on a pot, on a pot that's on the fire and it's boiling, and you put it in, right, and it boils it, for even if it's for a minute, take it out. I don't know how it's going to taste or look, but you could go ahead and throw it into your matzah. Right? I don't have the recipes
Cold water
here.
doesn't work.
Cold water does not work. It has to be mevushal to affect its status for the Seder night. Let's go for some questions here. Yes?
So any kind of like matzah byproduct, let's say matzah meal, that you would make some kind of pancake with or something.
Rule is, if it is cooked, it is fine. If it's baked, it's no good. Meaning a cookie made with matzah meal should not be eaten Erev Pesach. But on the other hand, if you cook it, like the knedel is a perfect ingredient of perfect food. It's a schluck to make, I know, but from what I hear, but it's a perfect ingredient for our Pesach because it is indeed cooked. Now, by the way, eating matzah is a minhag only Erev Pesach. There are those already that start from Rosh Chodesh. Then you have some real religious people from Purim. Then you have the real Goralists don't eat it the whole year. But halachically speaking, it's Erev Pesach. Okay, just be mindful of that. Yes.
If your minhag is not to eat the gross, which thank God is not my minhag, but if it is, are you allowed to have Play-Doh Erev Pesach? Because it's not doing Pesach.
You'd have to ask those who do. I think they have awareness already Erev Pesach. I think they only have a lenient 8 day. You'd have to ask those who have the privilege of a wonderful minute. Yes?
Is it just matzah that you're not allowed to eat Erev Pesach, or is it anything else that you eat at the Seder?
Okay, so that is a
My
good
mother-in-law
question.
wouldn't let us give apple juice to my kids because apples are in the karosas, which you eat on the Seder, and therefore nothing was okay Erev Pesach.
Mother-in-law. So Bisha, she's not seeing. Doesn't see what's happening. No, there are those. It is mentioned by them, but it's not halachic. Not halach. Specifically, when it comes, this is a statement that is already appears in the Jerusalem Talmud. Matzah, the matzah that you will be fulfilling your mitzvah with on the Seder night is one that you don't eat Erev Pesach. It's interesting that wine matzah. What do you mean? Like egg matzah? But we Ashkenazim don't eat it. You soak it. Give me the recipe. You have. Okay, I have to see what it is. Yeah, let's go for some questions.
Coming back to Kitniot.
Kitniot, yes.
Let's say you have a Sephardi visitor,
Yes.
and accidentally, not so accidentally, Kitniot come in contact with your dishes or oven or whatever. What's the status? It's
Okay.
not chometz.
It's
right?
not chametz, and therefore you don't really have. You try, but you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about. There are those who are of the opinion that kitniot is even nullified if 51% of a mixture, it would be fine. There are those who are of the opinion. So for sure you don't have to worry about it. You try to avoid it. Minhag is a minhag, but you don't have to worry about such things. There are those that try to have different kalim, but you don't have to worry, quote unquote, about kitniot. Yes.
I know juices, let's say 100% orange juice, liquid bought before Yom Tov is okay as long as you buy before, and hopefully it has a texture of 100%, whatever. There's a product called just egg whites,
Okay.
and I could see this being a really good product.
It seems like a good product.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay.
And it says that's the ingredient, just egg
What was the question?
The question is just egg whites. Now the truth is, I'll tell you the truth, that when it comes to Pesach, we have a standard that even an item like orange juice,